Planned, deliberate killing is no drawing-room accomplishment. It needs callousness of heart, insensitivity of mind, indifference to suffering, and contempt for human life. These are grim qualities repulsive in a man, in a woman, against nature. The calculating murderer is vile but comprehensible. The calculating murderess is an enigmatic paradox. Hence the compelling fascination of those cases where a woman stands charged with a premeditated murder. Reasoning and logic no longer seem sufficient. The onlooker is swayed by imponderable factors, imagination, instinct, the gulf of incongruity between the crime and the accused. He gazes on the figure in the dock. He notes the slight form, the gentle manner, the appealing face. Is it possible, he asks himself, that the Crown case is well-founded? Did Edith Thompson really instigate that crime and lead her victim, unsuspecting, to the appointed place of death? Did Lizzie Borden really slay her stepmother with a hatchet and then calmly wait her chance to slay her father likewise? Was Florence Maybrick really a systematic poisoner who did her beastly work for weeks and watched her husband die? Mrs. Thompson, Miss Borden, Mrs. Maybrick? In the same dread setting, for the same dread reason, their names have achieved unenviable immortality. And indeed, though widely separated by both time and space, the three women have many things in common. Up to a point, their stories coincide. The charge of murder, the long dramatic trial, a verdict ever after in dispute. Up to a point, their backgrounds coincide. The quiet home, the decent upbringing, the orderly, respectable routine. Up to a point, their very natures coincide. Each had a strong and forceful personality, determined to preserve its independence, and rebelling, in one form or another, against the bondage of domestic life. Only in the last analysis do the three-part company, but this final break is radical and sharp. Edith Thompson had passion but no breeding. Lizzie Borden had breeding but no passion. Florence Maybrick had both, and therein lies her own peculiar and poignant tragedy. The Maybrick story, with its disastrous denouncement, opens in America in 1881. In that year, Mr. James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton broker, paid a business visit to the United States. He was in his early 40s, a well-to-do bachelor of vigorous physique and sporting inclinations. In the course of his travels, he met Miss Florence Chandler, the daughter of a substantial Alabama banker. Florence Chandler was then only 18. Vivacious, beautiful, and sexually magnetic. James Maybrick promptly lost his heart, and when he returned to England, she came with him as his wife. The couple ultimately settled down at Aigburth, where they lived in conditions of considerable affluence. They had a fine, large house. They maintained several servants. Nothing was wanting for their two children or themselves. On the surface, at any rate, the union seemed happy, and the Maybrick menage, like a million others, firmly based upon mutual content. Then, in the early part of 1889, Mrs. Maybrick embarked on an intrigue. She had formed an attachment to a man named Brierly, and for a time there is no doubt she supposed herself in love. Brierly's attractions are a matter for conjecture. He hovers in the shadows of the case, represented only by a chilly, frightened note, written some weeks after his conquest was complete. "We had perhaps better not meet until late in the autumn." But the simple fact remains. Having given her husband a plausible excuse, an aunt, she said, was to undergo an operation. On March 21st, Mrs. Maybrick went to London, where she stayed with Brierly for 3 nights at a hotel. It should be recalled, for enlightenment, not an extenuation, that her husband was now 50 and she was 26. There are strong grounds for believing that James Maybrick had preceded her in a marital offense, but the 80s were the heyday of the sacred single standard, and his lapse, if lapse there was, passed straight into oblivion. Hers, when it came to light, outraged the prim Victorian conscience and seriously prejudiced her chances when she came to be tried by a jury of her peers. Mrs. Maybrick in due course returned from London and resumed her place as the lady of the house. Mr. Maybrick still did not know of her daring escapade. It is doubtful whether he ever did, although Mrs. Maybrick later said that on the day before his death, she made full confession and received entire forgiveness. These expressions, however, are ambiguous. But if there were gaps in Mr. Maybrick's knowledge, he was well aware that Brierly paid attention to his wife. Moreover, he resented it, and on March 31st he upbraided Mrs. Maybrick in very bitter terms. A violent quarrel followed, in the course of which, it seems, he struck her more than once and gave her a black eye. Mrs. Maybrick was indignant and distressed. She threatened to leave home. But there were the children to consider, and, through the family doctor's tactful mediation, the discord was resolved and the partners reconciled. Less than a month later, on April 27th, Maybrick showed the first signs of an illness that proved fatal. From that point, the scenes flicker like an early film, gathering evil momentum as they pass. Maybrick stricken with vomiting and pain, Maybrick better, Maybrick ill again, Mrs. Maybrick nursing him herself, doctors, more doctors, an uncertain diagnosis, Maybrick worse, Maybrick better, Maybrick worse than he had ever been, trained nurses summoned, Maybrick's brother arriving down from London, Maybrick sinking, Maybrick dying, Maybrick dead, and then the searching of the house and the discovery of arsenic, in jars, in packets, in tumblers, in pans, in bottles, on garments, on rags, on pocket handkerchiefs. This sinister search assumed still graver significance when a quantity of arsenic was found in Maybrick's corpse. Maybrick had died on Saturday, May 11th. The post-mortem took place on Monday, May 13th. On Tuesday, May 14th, Mrs. Maybrick was arrested. The accused's reaction to a charge of murder largely depends on the individual temperament. Some are goaded to hysterical activity. Some are incredulous. Some are stunned. It makes no difference in a prison cell. There is nothing you can do except rely on those outside. Relatives and friends must rally to your cause, organizing sympathy, combating rumor, giving reassurance, and preparing your defense. Mrs. Maybrick was devoid of such support. Her relatives were in a distant land, and those whom she had counted among her English friends were mostly nosing round in search of evidence against her. Sympathy was scant, rumor raged unchecked, and no one was at hand to offer comfort or advice. In her extremity, Mrs. Maybrick wrote to Brierly. "I am writing to you," she said, "to give me every assistance in your power in my present fearful trouble. I am in custody without any of my family with me and without money." This letter found its way not to Brierly but to the police. Forsaken and alone, Mrs. Maybrick remained until Messrs. Cleaver, a firm of Liverpool solicitors, took up the defense of the unhappy lady and briefed Sir Charles Russell to appear on her behalf. Russell was, by common consent, the greatest advocate of his generation. One is tempted to go further and roundly declare that the bar has never known his equal. But in advocacy, as in acting, it is hard to measure the giants of the past. You can read descriptions of a dead actor, but that is not the same as seeing him on the stage. You can read the speeches of a dead advocate, but that is not the same as hearing him in court. The force of a character, the magic of a presence, cannot be distilled at second hand. Irving or Garrick, Russell or Erskine? No reply can ever be conclusive, but of Russell at least this much may be said. There have been those who, as young men, saw Russell in action and who haunted the courts thereafter for another 50 years. They thus covered what I once heard Quinton Hogg describe as the golden age of the English bar, and though many remarkable counsel followed, Carson, Isaacs, and F.E. Smith among them, more often than not the veterans would agree that Russell was the greatest of them all. He was an able but not outstanding lawyer. As Lord Chief Justice, an office he accepted 6 years after his defense of Mrs. Maybrick, he had only mild success. But then Russell's disposition was the converse of judicial. By nature he was a fighter, who loved battling for a cause, and no forensic fighter ever carried stronger weapons. Here was no smooth charmer, trading in fair words and seeking victory by ingratiation. Russell's gift was power, the overwhelming influence of a giant personality. One judge called him an elemental force, and he must often have appeared to his opponents in this guise. His bearing was fearless, his oratory direct, his cross-examination raking and implacable. He was no respecter of persons, says his biographer Barry O'Brien. His blows fell indiscriminately on leaders and on juniors, and even, when the occasion warranted it, on judges. There was a bigness about the man that all appreciated. Russell was not primarily a criminal defender. His path had lain more among the fashionable society suits which were such a signal feature of his time. But in any kind of court, this masterful advocate was equally at home. His enlistment on the side of Mrs. Maybrick accorded her the champion of whom she stood in need. The coroner's inquest and the hearing by the bench poured fuel upon the rising flames of local indignation. Mrs. Maybrick's lapse with Brierly was the chief talk of the town, and colored every comment on the murder charge itself. She was a loose, foreign woman who had betrayed her English husband. Who could be surprised that she had poisoned him as well? Few were disposed to wait for the full facts. Rigid in righteousness and fierce with hate, Liverpool made up its mind. It did not trouble to conceal this prejudging of the issue. At the police court, Mrs. Maybrick was hissed by a gathering of ladies who, in dignity and moral sense and delicacy of taste, must be historically regarded as rivals of the harlots who danced in the streets at the trial of Oscar Wilde. The English law, to guard against such fits of mass hysteria, permits a trial to be transferred from the area of prejudice. The merits of this course were carefully weighed by Mrs. Maybrick's lawyers. She herself was clear upon the point. She wanted to be tried in London. "I should receive an impartial verdict there," she wrote, "which I cannot expect from a jury in Liverpool." But after due deliberation the lawyers recommended otherwise, and Mrs. Maybrick yielded to their view. Russell was to mention this matter in his final speech. "This lady," he said, "has elected to take her trial in Liverpool before a Liverpool jury, in the community with which her husband lived, in which he was known, and in which, upon a bare recital of the supposed facts of this case, it was inevitable that, to ill-informed and imperfectly informed minds, great and serious prejudice must have been caused. If she had desired to shrink from meeting a jury drawn from this community, she would not have had any difficulty interposed by those who represent the Crown. But she comes before you, asking from you nothing, save that you will willingly grant a careful, an attentive, and a sympathetic hearing to her case." She might ask, but would she get it? Were the 12 men of the neighborhood who formed the jury, 3 plumbers, 2 farmers, a wood-turner, a baker, a painter, a grocer, a provision merchant, a milliner, and an ironmonger, likely to be capable of putting from their minds the campaign of denigration amid which they had been living? Russell, notwithstanding, began the case with confidence. As he walked to the court on the first morning, he met a friend and entered into conversation. Not unnaturally, he was asked what he thought about his chances. "She'll be acquitted," Russell said. The trial of Florence Maybrick opened at Liverpool Assizes on July 31, 1889. The court was packed with an intently listening crowd, and, far beyond the confines of the courthouse and the city, millions followed the proceedings as if personally concerned. Seldom has the battle for an individual's life been fought out in an atmosphere of such continuous tension. Leading counsel for the Crown was Mr. Addison, Q.C. He was a popular Northern Circuit silk, not in the highest flight perhaps, but a thoroughly sound advocate of ripe experience. If he could not match Russell's stature, at least he was not the man to be put off or overawed. Through the 5 days of conflict that went before the summing up, Addison never failed to make a valid point. It early became apparent that though there was much detailed evidence in prospect, the prosecution rested on 3 main pillars. There were the fly papers, there was the meat juice, and there was a letter written by the prisoner to Brierly only 3 days before her husband died. In his opening, Addison dealt with each in turn and explained the interpretation placed upon them by the Crown. The fly papers, and be it noted, the fly papers alone, were put forward as the source from which the prisoner procured arsenic. On April 24th, Mrs. Maybrick had bought a dozen. On the 29th, from a different chemist, she had bought 2 dozen more. Some were seen by servants in the Maybrick's bedroom, soaking in a basin which was covered by a towel. Addison linked these purchases with James Maybrick's illness, which he recalled began on April 27th. Maybrick was very bad indeed that day, and the day following, but on the 29th he was considerably better. "It is an extraordinary thing," Addison remarked, "that when her husband was just recovering, she should have bought these further flypapers." That was the extent of the evidence on the flypapers. It showed that Mrs. Maybrick had had them in her possession. It gave ground for suspicion that she had tried to extract arsenic, but there was nothing to prove that any arsenic was extracted, or for what purpose any such arsenic had been used. The evidence on the meat juice went a good deal further. During the greater part of his illness, as Addison pointed out, Mrs. Maybrick had regulated all her husband's medicines. Then in the closing stage, the trained nurses appeared. One of these asserted that she saw Mrs. Maybrick tamper with a meat juice bottle before a dose was due. The nurse took care not to give it to the patient, and it was subsequently found to contain half a grain of arsenic. This Addison described with laudable moderation as one of the serious features of the case. Although in kind and sequel, this was the gravest charge of tampering. It is necessary to add that it did not stand alone. According to the nurses and to Mr. Maybrick's brother, Mrs. Maybrick's conduct was generally suspicious. She didn't behave openly. She changed the contents of the bottles. She caused the dying man to say she was giving him wrong medicines. The prosecution's third prop, Mrs. Maybrick's letter to Brierly of May 8th, worked up into a major issue of the trial. Dashed off hurriedly by a tired and harassed woman, it was examined at the time and has been debated since with a meticulous precision more appropriate to a statute. This letter, like the other previously mentioned, never arrived at its intended destination. Mrs. Maybrick, tied to the sick room, handed it for posting to a servant, Alice Yap. Yap, by her own account, dropped it on the ground and opened it, intending to replace the dirty envelope. But, having opened it, she read it. Having read it, she retained it, and subsequently she passed it to Mr. Maybrick's brother, with consequences that cannot be computed even now. Russell went so far as to declare that, but for this letter, no charge would have been made. Dearest, your letter under cover to John K. came to hand just after I had written to you on Monday. I did not expect to hear from you so soon, and had delayed in giving him the necessary instructions. Since my return, I have been nursing James day and night. He is sick unto death. The doctors held a consultation yesterday, and now all depends upon how long his strength will hold out. Both my brothers-in-law are here, and we are terribly anxious. I cannot answer your letter fully today, my darling, but relieve your mind of all fear of discovery now and in the future. James has been delirious since Sunday, and I know now that he is perfectly ignorant of everything, even of the name of the street, and also that he has not been making any inquiries whatever. The tale he told me was a pure fabrication, and only intended to frighten the truth out of me. In fact, he believes my statement, although he will not admit it. You need not therefore go abroad on that account, dearest, but in any case, please don't leave England until I have seen you once again. You must feel that those 2 letters of mine were written under circumstances which must even excuse their injustice in your eyes. Do you suppose that I could act as I am doing if I really felt and meant what I inferred then? If you wish to write to me about anything, do so now, as all the letters pass through my hands at present. Excuse this scrawl, my own darling, but I dare not leave the room for a moment, and I do not know when I shall be able to write to you again. In haste, yours ever, Florrie. No question but that this gave indications of misconduct. Did it go further and breathe a hint of murder? So the prosecution claimed, laying special stress upon the passage, "He is sick unto death." The doctors held a consultation yesterday, and now all depends upon how long his strength can hold out. It is perfectly true that at the time this note was written, the doctors did not take a pessimistic view. They thought James Maybrick was seriously ill. They did not think he was at all likely to die. On May 7th, said one of them in the box, I formed a hopeful prognosis and thought he would soon recover. On the 8th, I found him better. His condition was still as hopeful? Inquired counsel. Yes. Did you say to Mrs. Maybrick, or use any words to the effect that all depended on how long he could hold out? No. Did you say that he was sick unto death, or any words to that effect? No. Had he been in any way delirious since the Sunday? No. So the Crown could and did legitimately argue that whatever prompted Mrs. Maybrick's dire forebodings, it was not the opinions of her medical advisers. These, then, were the questions confronting the defense. Why did Mrs. Maybrick buy and soak the fly papers? How did arsenic get into the meat juice? What was the foundation for the statement in her letter that on May 8th her husband was sick unto death? Here, in fine and stripped of inessentials, was the case on which the Crown relied to send her to the gallows. In his opening, Addison refrained from lengthy comment and contented himself for the most part with a recital of the facts. Occasionally Russell growled out a correction. For the rest, he sat as he always did when not himself in action, stern, glowering, infinitely formidable. The first witness was Michael Maybrick, brother of the deceased, who had arrived from London on the fateful 8th of May. In his own words, he was dissatisfied with the case, and he criticized the treatment that his brother had received. In fact, Michael Maybrick had promptly made up his mind that his brother was being poisoned, and that it was Mrs. Maybrick who was poisoning him. One can understand, if not excuse, this precipitate conclusion. Minds, too, can be poisoned, and events had conspired to work on Michael Maybrick's. He had been summoned by a telegram that said, "Strange things are happening." He had heard about the fly papers in the cab going out to Aghberth. He had seen the captured letter as he stepped inside the house. Add to all this the shock of his brother's serious illness, and it may well be that his state of mind did not conduce to calm assessment. Certain it is that he engendered among the nurses grave suspicions that did not exist before. Russell brought this out in a sharp cross-examination. Had you from the first a strong suspicion in the case? I had. And you expressed this suspicion openly to Mrs. Maybrick and the nurses? Not to the nurses. Did you not, sir? The ring of Russell's voice echoes down the years. Did you not, sir? Are you not aware that instructions were given to the nurses? Michael Maybrick fenced. Oh, you mean the hospital nurses? There were no others, bar the children's nurse. Inquisitive Alice Yap. I said the nurses. Yes, I was aware that they had been given instructions. Instructions which would convey the idea that there was felt, by those interested in the case, considerable suspicion? Yes, admitted Michael Maybrick. That is so. Russell was not merely attacking Michael Maybrick. He was undermining in advance the evidence of other witnesses, those who saw Mrs. Maybrick tampering with bottles. It is notorious that people see what they expect to see. Primed observers are as dubious as spies. Having thus set the stage, Russell got to grips with the fundamental questions. Presently, he was driving hard and deep into the prosecution's case. The second witness was a Dr. Hopper. He had not attended Maybrick during his last illness but had treated him on and off for many years. It was Hopper, incidentally, who had acted as peacemaker between Maybrick and his wife. When did you first attend Mr. Maybrick? Russell asked. As far back as 1882. Were his complaints always the same? Generally? To do with the liver and digestive organs? Yes. Was he given to dosing himself? Yes, he was. Had he a habit of taking larger doses than were prescribed? Yes. Did he know arsenic as a nerve tonic? I believe so. Did he tell you that he had taken arsenic when he was in America? I gathered as much from his conversation. As early as June 1888, did Mrs. Maybrick speak to you about certain habits of her husband's? In June or September. What did she say to you? She told me Mr. Maybrick was in the habit of taking some very strong medicine which had a bad influence on him, for he always seemed worse after each dose. She wished me to see him about it. To remonstrate with him? Yes. Here was laid down the foundation of a substantive defense which Russell built up brick by brick as opportunity arose. Here was a plausible alternative explanation of the presence of arsenic in James Maybrick's body. Here, too, though not so instantly apparent, was a plausible explanation of its presence in the meat juice. In cross-examination, Russell never denied that it was Mrs. Maybrick who had put arsenic in the meat juice. This meant that she herself did not deny it. The question therefore was, in what circumstances and with what motive was it done? The defense, at a later stage, tendered an explanation with which James Maybrick's habit was intimately linked. There was no dramatic set piece on the first day of the trial, no outstanding single coup in cross-examination. But as one Crown witness followed on another, Russell kept extracting valuable admissions. It was agreed by the chemist who sold the first lot of fly papers that he lived near Mrs. Maybrick and knew her very well. It was agreed by the chemist who sold the second lot of fly papers that Mrs. Maybrick had an account running at his shop. It was agreed by this same gentleman that arsenic is used in many cosmetic preparations. It was agreed by Edwin Maybrick, another of James's brothers, that on April 30th he took Mrs. Maybrick to a ball. This statement, seemingly so trivial, was to grow in importance as the case developed. When Russell left the court at the end of the first day, he could look with satisfaction on the progress so far made. He had proved out of the mouths of prosecution witnesses that suspicion had been planted and Mrs. Maybrick's guilt assumed, that the purchase of the fly papers was frank and above board, that arsenic was a common constituent of cosmetics, and that Maybrick was accustomed to eat arsenic himself. An effective defense had started to take shape. The most sensational event in the second day's hearing was Russell's cross-examination of the nursemaid Alice Yap. In one sense, Russell was on very sure ground. Yap's story as it stood did her the minimum of credit. She sought to justify her act in opening the letter by a tale which would strain the belief of the most credulous. Without colorable excuse, she had read the letter's contents, a mean form of prying that invited strong contempt. By any standard, her behavior was despicable. She may have felt sorry for it by the time Russell had done. Before coming to the letter, he questioned Yap about the soaking of the fly papers. Did the housemaid tell you she had seen them in the morning? Yes. And you went into the room after dinner was over? It was about 2 hours after when I went into the room. Out of curiosity? Yes. You had no business in the room. No. You found them still there as the housemaid had described them? Yes. Where were they? On the washstand. In the principal bedroom? Yes. In the bedroom which is directly approached from the landing? Yes. Could you see this washstand on entering the door? Yes. These flypapers were reported to you as having been there early in the morning, and you have no reason to suppose that they didn't continue there the whole day until you saw them. No. So the soaking of the flypapers was as open as their purchase. No need to stress it further, having elicited from Yap one more important fact, that Maybrick had got wet on the day he first took ill. Russell switched to the vulnerable flank. Now, he said slowly, with regard to this letter. Alice Yap must have been waiting for this moment, waiting with dread for the impending storm to break. She had doubtless heard a great deal about Charles Russell and his tearing asunder of shufflers and knaves. Not that she, Alice Yap, was to be bracketed with these, but still, a clever lawyer might present her in that light. Small wonder if her heart quailed as she gazed on the spectacle, the judge aloft in scarlet, the rows of enthralled onlookers, the terrifying Russell standing there below. He lost no time in striking at the heart. With regard to this letter, why did you open it? Alice Yap hesitated. Because Mrs. Maybrick wished that it should go by that post. Why did you open it? Alice Yap had made one nebulous reply. Now she stood tongue-tied and made no reply at all. The judge intervened. Did anything happen to the letter? Yes, said Alice Yap. It fell in the dirt. Why did you open it? Russell thundered. To put it in a clean envelope. Why didn't you put it in a clean envelope without opening it? This was a poser. Alice Yap said nothing. Was it a wet day? It was showery. Are you sure of that? Yes. Will you undertake to say that? It was like a warning bell. I ask you to consider, was it a wet day? Again, Alice Yap said nothing. Aye or no? Silence. Was it a wet or a dry day? Silence. Will you swear that it was showery? I cannot say positively. It was now apparent that Yap could not remember and was unwilling to commit herself, and it was equally apparent that if the ground was dry, there could not have been much dirt for the letter to be dropped in. Let me see the letter, Russell said. He turned it over, examining it closely. Where was it dropped? By the post office. Then you picked it up? Yes. And saw this mark on it, did you? Yes. Usher, give the letter to the witness. The envelope with its pathetic inscription was passed across the court. Just take it in your hand. Is the direction clear enough? Alice Yap reflected. It was very much dirtier at the time. It has not obscured the direction? No. You didn't rub the mud off? No. What did you do? I went into the post office and asked for a clean envelope to readdress it. I opened it as I was going in. There is no running of the ink? No. Russell glared at her, his underlip thrust forward. Can you suggest how there can be any damp or wet without causing some running of the ink? I cannot. On your oath, girl, did you not manufacture that stain as an excuse for opening your mistress's letter? I did not. Have you any explanation to offer about the running of the ink? I have not. Russell sat down, and Alice Yap thankfully vanished from the scene. Her public humiliation was thorough and deserved. But where exactly did this cross-examination lead? Alice Yap had been demolished. The letter remained with its detrimental phrases. He is sick unto death. All depends on how long his strength can hold out. Later, Russell pleaded that the servants and the nurses, together with certain visiting friends, had formed a gloomier view of Maybrick's illness than the doctors, and that Mrs. Maybrick was influenced by them. That letter, take it, read it, scan it as you will, is it the letter of a guilty woman who is planning the murder of her husband? Maybe, maybe not. But the letter was the one item in the Crown's evidence that retained its early force, unimpaired right till the end. Thus far, the trial had proceeded on the footing that there was only one question for the jury to decide. Did Mrs. Maybrick willfully administer the quantities of arsenic that caused her husband's death? There is no reason to doubt, Addison had said, what the doctors will swear, that Maybrick died by arsenic. But now Russell was to challenge this assumption. He was to bring into discussion a second vital question. Did Maybrick die by arsenic at all? This new factor was impressively introduced just before the court rose on the second afternoon. The three other servants had followed Alice Yap, and now Dr. Humphreys occupied the box. He was the first Crown witness, there were several more to come, who supported Addison's statement on the cause of Maybrick's death. He died, said Humphreys, from arsenical poisoning. The interrogation by prosecuting counsel had concluded, and Humphreys turned a little to face Russell. It was getting very late. There was only just sufficient time to start the cross-examination, a state of affairs which every advocate dislikes. Too often the choice lies between a premature disclosure of one's hand and the undignified expedient of playing out time. Russell did neither. With consummate skill, he turned the situation to his favor. Altogether that evening, he put about a dozen questions. The last 5, and the replies they drew, were these. Had you ever before assisted at a post-mortem examination of any person supposed to have died from arsenical poisoning? No. Had you ever before assisted at a post-mortem where it was alleged that death was due to irritant poisoning? No. Up to the time that the communication was made to you, which suggested that there might be foul play, did it in any way occur to you that there were symptoms present of arsenical poisoning? No. When was it that the idea was first suggested to you? On Thursday or Wednesday night. By Mr. Michael Maybrick? Yes. The court adjourned in excitement. That last few minutes had achieved a transformation. An astonishing possibility now loomed on the horizon, that the doctors would never have bethought themselves of poisoning if Michael Maybrick hadn't put the idea into their heads. That night, the jurymen had something to think over. The next day, the third of Mrs. Maybrick's trial, Russell resumed his questioning of Humphreys with the satisfying certainty that he held the initiative. The doctor was placed on the defensive from the start, and despite his struggles, beat retreat after retreat. Over Reinsch's test, he had a specially rough passage. This test is designed to detect metallic irritants. A sample of excreta is boiled under specified conditions, and if the irritant is present, it should show as a deposit. Dr. Humphreys had carried out this test on Maybrick 48 hours before the latter died. There had been no deposit, as he honestly confessed. He tried very hard, but not very successfully, to reconcile this illuminating fact with the theory of poisoning to which he now subscribed. The exchanges on this matter are worth reporting fully. They show what can happen when a witness seeks to temporize under the guns of a first-class cross-examiner. "So the test was negative," said Russell, after Humphreys had described it. "No," Humphreys said. "Not of necessity." "Why not?" Dr. Humphreys made a most ingenuous reply. "Because the quantity I used was so small, and the time I boiled it so short that there might not have been time for any deposit to take place. Further, I'm not skilled in the details of testing, and my test might have been inefficient. That is candid, Doctor." No doubt Russell's acknowledgment was genuine, but he knew that Humphreys had played into his hands. "That is candid? Then you mean to say that although you tried this experiment, you were not able to conduct it successfully?" A nasty question for a medical man. But Humphreys resolutely spurned the bait. "I do not pretend to have any skill in these matters. It is not a difficult test? No. And if there is arsenic, it is supposed to make a deposit? Yes, if it is boiled long enough." "How long did you boil it?" "About 2 minutes." "What quantity did you take?" "About an ounce." "Was this quantity sufficient?" "Quite sufficient." "So I should have thought. Did you not at that time think your experiment was properly conducted?" Humphreys floundered. "I really couldn't tell." "Dr. Humphreys, you were making the experiment with some object?" "Yes." "Were you satisfied at the time that it was properly conducted?" "At the time, I had no books to refer to." "When you came to refresh your memory from books, were you satisfied there was nothing you omitted?" "Yes." Whichever way he turned, the doctor found escape shut off. He made another desperate bid. "I don't know whether the instruments were absolutely pure. But see, Dr. Humphreys, if they were not pure, would you not get a greater amount of deposit?" "It depends on what the impurity was." "What impurity do you suggest may have existed?" "Arsenic." "If there was arsenic, would it not make it more certain you would get a deposit?" "Yes." "Did you find any?" "I found none." After that, Russell moved into the kill. "Had it not been for the suggestion of arsenic by Michael Maybrick, were you prepared to give a death certificate if James had died on Wednesday?" "Yes." "With what cause of death?" "Gastroenteritis." It was a tremendous, breathtaking admission. The judge wanted to make absolutely sure. "If nothing about poisoning had been suggested to you, you would have certified that he died of gastroenteritis?" "Yes, my lord." The judge wrote solemnly in his book. There was not much left of Dr. Humphreys now, but Russell fired one final telling shot. "Can you mention any post-mortem symptom which is distinctive of arsenical poisoning and not also distinctive of gastroenteritis?" The witness thought. "No," he said, "I can't give you any." This triumphant climax shook the whole fabric of the prosecution's case. All that day, and half the next, They tried to shore it up while Russell tenaciously clung to his advantage. In vain for Dr. Carter, who had been called in for consultations, to add his opinion that death was due to arsenical poisoning. He had to admit that the symptoms caused by arsenic might equally be caused by impure food. In vain for Dr. Stevenson, the Home Office toxicologist, to throw his reputation and prestige into the scale. Exceptional experience made him a subtler duelist, but he also gave ground to Russell in the end. "Will you indicate any one symptom?" Russell asked him, "which you say is distinctly an arsenical poisoning symptom, and which is not to be found in cases of gastroenteritis?" "I would form no opinion from one single symptom." "What do you mean by that answer? That you cannot point to any distinct symptom of arsenical poisoning, differentiating it from gastroenteritis?" Dr. Stevenson had to face it. "There is no distinctive diagnostic symptom of arsenical poisoning," he said. "The diagnostic thing is finding the arsenic." Which, of course, was precisely Russell's point. They found some arsenic, so they called it arsenic poisoning. If they had not found arsenic, they would have called it something else. And Russell had shown how the arsenic might have come there, in a series of self-administered non-fatal doses unconnected with the ailment from which Maybrick really died. There was, in fact, no murder at all. The chronic arsenic eater had met his death from natural causes. That, in a nutshell, was the case for the defense. When the Crown case closed at the end of the fourth morning, the defense held a position of considerable strength. Measures were now taken to render it still stronger. Russell, in his turn, called 3 distinguished doctors. Each affirmed that the cause of death was gastroenteritis. A whole series of witnesses from England and abroad cast further light on Maybrick's arsenic addiction. One, Sir James Poole, a former mayor of the city, said that Maybrick once had blurted out his taste for poisonous medicines. Sir James had been horrified and given him a lecture. "The more you take, the more you will require. You will go on till they carry you off." The Crown, it should be noted, did not dispute this evidence. Viewed broadly, then, the prisoner's case was powerful and imposing. But 2 important points remained that needed clearing up. Still those flypapers. Why had Mrs. Maybrick soaked the flypapers? The ground had been admirably prepared for an answer, but the answer itself had not yet been forthcoming. Still, that meat juice. What on earth had happened to that meat juice? Here was a wide gap in the walls of the defense. These matters still urgently called for explanation, and the fact was that only Mrs. Maybrick could explain them. Only she could account for her own conduct. Only she could relate what she had done. Had Mrs. Maybrick's trial been taking place today, as a matter of course, she would have gone into the box. But 60 years ago, before the Criminal Evidence Act, no prisoner could testify on his own behalf. By leave, an unsworn statement might be delivered from the dock. Such statements labored under a heavy handicap. They lacked the sanction which attaches to the oath. They lacked the logical development imposed by guiding questions. They could not be made the subject of cross-examination, but even this rule had a double-edged effect. Should Mrs. Maybrick make such a statement? She herself was willing, but on Russell lay the burden of decision. The problem must have exercised him greatly. The risks would be acute, the strain almost intolerable, but how else to close that catastrophic gap? As the last of his witnesses departed from the box, Russell turned to his client, sitting in the dock behind him. They spoke briefly in undertones. Then Russell faced the judge. "My lord," he said, "I wish to tell you what has taken place. I asked Mrs. Maybrick if it was her wish to make a statement. She said yes. I asked her if it was written. She said no." She stood up in the dock, hands trembling but head erect. It was the worst moment of all. Agony enough to sit silent hour by hour while the crowds in court eyed you and whispered. Worse agony by far to lose the shield of counsel and yourself speak the words on which the verdict might depend. This was the ordeal of young Mrs. Maybrick on the 5th successive day of the trial for her life. At first she faltered, and the sentences came stumbling. "My lord, I wish to make a statement as well as I can to you. A few facts in connection with this dreadfully crushing charge." But her voice soon steadied. She kept her nerves under control, and, whatever its faults, her statement was relevant and appropriate. She explained first how the flypapers were bought for a cosmetic. She had lost, she said, an American prescription containing arsenic, and having a slight skin eruption, tried to concoct a substitute. She was particularly concerned to get rid of this eruption before April 30th, when she was going to a ball. There had been numerous signposts to this part of her story. On the subject of the meat juice, she sprang more of a surprise. Maybrick, she said, had complained of being depressed. He had pointed out a powder which he referred to as harmless and implored Mrs. Maybrick to put it in his food. "I was overwrought, terribly anxious, miserably unhappy, and his evident distress entirely unnerved me. I consented. My lord, I had not one true or honest friend in that house. I had no one to consult and no one to advise me." The statement lasted 5 torturing minutes, torturing to speaker and to listeners alike. At last it was over, and she sank back in her chair. Russell, pulling his gown about him, gathered himself for his big speech to the jury. Russell was not a rhetorician. No purple patches ornamented his address. It was like the man himself, forceful, incisive, firmly based on fact. He reminded the jury that there were 2 distinct questions for them to consider. Was it a death by arsenical poisoning? If they were not satisfied of that, there was an end to the case. If, however, they found that arsenic was indeed the cause of death, was such arsenic administered by the prisoner? If they were not satisfied of that, there was an end to the case also. Russell then reviewed the medical evidence in detail. He recalled the opinions categorically expressed by the 3 eminent experts brought by the defense. He recalled the failure by the experts for the Crown to name a single symptom that was not shared in common by arsenical poisoning and gastroenteritis. He recalled the long history of Maybrick's dyspepsia and the equally long history of his arsenic addiction. He recalled, in this context, the results of the analysis which disclosed only a small amount of arsenic in the corpse. He wound up this part of his speech with a powerful plea deriving from long acquaintance with the psychology of juries. "It would only be natural," Russell said, "that the thought should arise in your minds. If not arsenical poisoning, we should like to have some suggestion what it was. Now, I am not called upon to advance any theory. Counsel representing the prisoner is entitled to stand upon a defense and to say, 'You have not proved the case which you alleged.' But passing that by, is there no reasonable hypothesis? Is it improbable that a man who had been dosing himself, admittedly taking poisonous medicines, is it remarkable that this man's constitution had suffered so that he should always be complaining of derangement of the stomach? Is it? Or is it not reasonable to say that a man who had been pursuing such a course would have his constitution liable to attack from causes which, in a healthy man, would be of no effect? And thus to the submission, 'There is no safe resting place on which you can justify to yourselves a finding that this was a death of arsenical poisoning.' This had become the strongest plank in the defense, so strong indeed that it would not have been surprising if the jury had acquitted without hearing any more. Russell himself seems to have half expected this. "I must ask you," he had said, "even at the outset, whether it is possible for you to find the prisoner guilty." That was a broad hint that they could stop it if they wished. But the jury did not stop it, and Russell, rightly declining any vestige of a gamble, went on to discuss the second question he had posed. Had Mrs. Maybrick administered arsenic, barring always the isolated instance of the meat juice? He summarized his previous points and added a few fresh ones. Mrs. Maybrick, he emphasized, knew she was a suspect from May 8th. The searching of the house, with its abundant haul of arsenic, did not take place until the 11th or the 12th. Why, if she was guilty, did not Mrs. Maybrick cover up the traces of her crime? If a woman had the nerve and fiber to plan such a murder, cold and deliberate, would she have not also had the instinct of self-preservation? Neatly he made the large amount of arsenic found seem to operate in Mrs. Maybrick's favor. If, as is clear, there was in that house a quantity of poison capable of being fatally applied, if there was one packet of arsenic with which, admittedly, flypapers had nothing to do, if there was a bottle in which grains of arsenic were found with which, admittedly, flypapers had nothing to do, I ask why, with these means at her command, should she have resorted to the stupid contrivance of trying to steep flypapers in water? There was no peroration in the accepted sense, no rolling periods, no high-flown similes. But who could fail to be impressed by the awful gravity with which he summoned the jurors to the climax of their task? You are in number large enough to prevent the individual views and prejudices and prepossessions of one from affecting all, but in numbers small enough to preserve to each one of you the undivided sense of individual responsibility. The verdict is to be the verdict of each one of you and the verdict of you all. I make no appeal for mercy. Let that be clearly understood. You are administering a law which is merciful. You are administering a law which forbids you to pronounce a verdict of guilty unless all reasonable hypotheses of innocence have been excluded. I end as I began by asking you, in the perplexities, in the doubts, in the difficulties which surround this case, can you with safe conscience say that this woman is guilty? If your duty compels you to do it, you will do it, you must do it. But you will not, you must not, unless the whole burden and facts and weight of the case drive you irresistibly to that conclusion. Addison's reply was vigorous and barbed. His assertions about Maybrick seemed to verge on the extravagant. He was not an arsenic eater. He was a healthy, careful man. In April, he was sick for the first time in his life. Addison bitterly criticized Mrs. Maybrick's statement, carefully thought out and ably delivered. He made a shrewd thrust at the suggestion that Maybrick took arsenic shortly before his death. He, who knew medicine so well and was so fond of talking about them, never suggested to a soul that the symptoms might be due to that. Without mercy, he dissected the famous note to Brierly. I protest against the notion of any tenderness for a husband in a woman who wrote that letter. And finally, if she be guilty, we have brought to light a very terrible deed of darkness, and proved a murder founded upon profligacy and adultery, and carried out with a hypocrisy and cunning which have been rarely equaled in the annals of crime. It was the evening of the 5th day, and the court rose. Next morning the judge began his long, painstaking, intermittently intelligible summing up. A word about the judge into whose hands the directing reins now passed. Mr. Justice Fitzjames Stephen was a man of high attainments. Literateur of taste, essayist of note, close friend of Froude and of Carlyle, he embraced and enjoyed a wider range of interests than is customary among members of the legal profession. As a judge, he adhered to broad principles and disliked mere technicalities. His mind, hard and clear rather than subtle, was adept in the marshalling of facts. He was scrupulously fair, conscientiously humane, and a recognized authority on the rules of criminal evidence. Few men would have been better fitted to try the Maybrick case than Mr. Justice Stephen in his prime. But it is the undeniable and tragic fact that by the late summer of 1889, this able and distinguished mind was on the wane. 4 years earlier, Stephen had had a stroke, which caused him temporarily to give up work. Soon after he resumed, a slow decline set in. Gradually, over a period of years, his mental powers diminished. At last, prompted by reports of public uneasiness, the anxious judge consulted his physician. An insidious disease was diagnosed, and he instantly resigned. How long this disease had flourished undetected cannot be asserted with precision, but everything suggests it was already stirring at the time of the Maybrick trial 20 months before. The summing up, so thorough in conception, it took the best part of 2 days to deliver, was in execution rambling and blurred. From first to last, the judge seemed all at sea. He told the jury that the fly papers had been purchased in March and was somewhat testy when corrected. He attributed the opinions of one doctor to another. He read out a letter which had not been put in evidence. He said things which were dangerously misleading. If you can show a sufficient quantity of arsenic to cause death, why then you need go no further. He said things which were highly prejudicial in effect. On that day began the symptoms of what may be called the fatal dose. He said things which were free from any meaning whatsoever. You are apt to assume a connection between the thing which is a proof in the result at which you are to arrive, because it is put before you. And in that way, you may be led to do a greater or less degree of injustice according to the state of the case. The complaint that lies against the judge is not one of undue bias. He did his best, no doubt, to hold the balance. His shortcoming was this, that he failed to clarify the issues, to state accurately the facts, and to group the evidence in appropriate perspective. Thus, at the end of a momentous and complicated case, the jury received no adequate direction. Whether this particular jury would have profited by such is an entirely different matter. At 3:20 on the 7th afternoon, the jury retired to deliberate in private. If they had made up their minds in favor of acquittal, it might be assumed that they would not be absent long. If not, the field of discussion was so vast, and the matters to be weighed so debatable and intricate, that an interval of hours could occasion no surprise. They were back at 5-4. 10 minutes later, their verdict had been given, and Mrs. Maybrick had been sentenced to be hanged. Whatever the immediate Liverpool reaction, the country as a whole was deeply shocked by this result. The Times condemned it editorially. Leading lawyers and doctors set on record their disquiet. Meetings were held to voice protest and dissent. Petitions for reprieve were signed by tens of thousands, nor were official circles lacking in activity. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, held a series of long conferences with the judge, with the Lord Chancellor, with certain witnesses, with the judge again, with the judge and Mr. Addison. These indications of misgiving in high places corresponded with the raging tide of public disapproval. Meanwhile, the days slipped by, and the condemned woman lay in Walton Prison, where the tedium of solitary confinement was relieved by the hammering of the workmen setting up her scaffold. On August 22nd, with only one more Sunday between her and the rope, Mrs. Maybrick was reprieved. The death sentence was rescinded and replaced by one of penal servitude for life. At that time, reprieves were not come by 2 a penny, nor was there much squeamishness at the thought of hanging women. Mrs. Maybrick's neck was saved for the most logical of reasons, because the case against her fell short of legal proof. Although, said the Home Secretary, the evidence leads clearly to the conclusion that the prisoner administered and attempted to administer arsenic to her husband with intent to murder, yet it does not wholly exclude a reasonable doubt whether his death was in fact caused by the administration of arsenic. If there was reasonable doubt, she was not guilty of murder. That was the only indictment upon which she had been tried. The life sentence was administratively imposed for an attempt to murder with which she had not been charged. Russell, first as counsel, then as head of the judiciary, never ceased to press for Mrs. Maybrick's release. He met with no success. He himself died in 1900. Mrs. Maybrick was not freed till 1904. She had lost her youth, her spirit, and 15 years out of her life. Did Mrs. Maybrick do it? That is not the problem. Was her guilt proved? Unquestionably no. In later years, a verdict so perverse would have been quashed by the Court of Criminal Appeal. In 1889, that court did not exist. All that could be done was done, but this was not enough. And the verdict of that jury unhappily remains to mock at and discredit the fair name of British justice.